welcome to This is Africa. My name is Stanley Kwenda, and today we are going to be discussing about the reactions of the Zimbabwean economy after the 31 July elections. And to do that, I have with me once again Christopher Mugaga, an economist. Christopher, welcome to the program.
A pleasure, man. Thank you.
Christopher, on Monday was the first day of trading after the July 31 election. And since then, we have seen quite a number of withdrawals, cash withdrawals from the banks, as well as a fall in the industrial bourse by about 11%. Why is it like that?
Well, if you look at the events on the ground, it's quite true that the opening of trade this Monday, it's seen the market shedding about 11%, with the total value of the market, which we call the market capitalization, shedding significantly since April of 2009. It's also very true that in terms of bank deposits, there had been quite massive withdrawals, which we cannot necessarily call maybe bank runs at this juncture. But this could all be a symptom of confidence at its rock bottom, knowing very well that this is an election result which was not possibly expected, even by those who might have won the election itself. This is an economy which had been under different phases. The ZANU-PF government prior to 2008 had witnessed the economy collapsing to the extent of the almost obliteration of the local unit, which is the Zim dollar. So naturally, a re-comeback of such a party which had policies which had seen its currents dwindling normally will be received with the level of pessimism. The market could not accept it. This is a market which is still trying to come to reality in terms to the events of a ZANU-PF victory. And there seems to be no going back when it comes to a recourse, especially from the former opposition leader, that is Morgan Tsvangirai.
It seems at the moment that everything seems to be on the standstill. Could it be that the market does not like a ZANU-PF government? Could it have been preferred something else other than ZANU-PF?
It's neither here nor there. Sometimes when you look at markets, how they respond, I think we are quite sure also that with the re-election of Barack Obama, the Dow Jones, which is the main index on the Wall Street, it shed quite significantly. But maybe what is going to separate what we are seeing on the ground in terms of market performance and the events going forward is to do with the nature of the government Mugabe is expected to swear in, possibly, which is quite also a case that in the next fortnight Mugabe will be swearing a new government. If the same government of people will not be honest, people who have been corrupt, like with ministers who are still alleged to have been quite corrupt, if they are to come back, possibly you will see that it will take quite massive turns of a massive direction for the economy to take a new look. But as things stand right now, we might not necessarily say there's need to panic. We know for sure that the market had been rallying upward prior to the election of 31 July. It's a market which had registered its dismay and possibly dissatisfaction in as far as the victory by ZANU-PF is concerned. And people might wonder why possibly ZANU-PF is causing all this turmoil in terms of the market direction. Well, it's quite true that the indigenization policy had not been friendly to investors. Just looking at the Zimbabwe Stock Exchange, you realize that the greater percentage of those who are investing on the market, they are foreigners. If you do a market analysis from 2009 when we turned to US dollar, you realize that about 36% of the investors on the market had been foreigners, but just last year on average we had about 46% of investors who are foreign, mostly dominated by South Africans. These are people who are trying to resubmit and to realign their cash flows. As you know very well that most of the developed worlds or markets had been on a downturn. So given such facts, you realize that Zimbabwe had been receiving the battering following an election victory, and this battering may not persist possibly in the medium to long run, knowing for sure that indigenization is there to stay. So those investors who are willing and able to put their money in Zimbabwe, they might put up with it going forward.
And Christopher, this election is not done and dusted as yet. There have been, post-election disputes, like, for example, as we speak right now, the Movement for Democratic Change Party, led by Mr. Morgan Tsvangirai, is challenging the ZANU-PF election victory. Is it not likely to worsen this economic chill that we started witnessing on Monday?
It's quite going to take an interesting pace. It's true indeed that the MDC position in terms of rejecting the election, declaring it a nullity, they are going to be entertained, they are going to enter the veins of financial markets. But we are hoping and seeing it that possibly going forward 2 weeks down the line, chances are quite high from an MDC side to look to it and say, look, Our costs might not be as balanced as we want them to be. SADC had already somehow endorsed the elections and AU. So from an economic perspective, to expect a shift in position in terms of these regional bodies in as far as this plebiscite is concerned possibly is to be asking for too much. We really don't think it's going to eat into the market potential going forward. As you know, there's a history in Zimbabwe of elections being disputed, and even when the elections were held, they were held under an environment of dispute where you know most of the tenets of the SADC framework since the consummation of GPA were not exercised. There was still the issue of human rights violations like alleged, the issue of media biasness where you could see the state broadcaster was not balanced. You could also look at issues to do with security sector, which the MDC members were saying it needs reform. But them going into such an election knowing that the ground was tilted against them will push them possibly to the oblivion for now. And I personally don't think an MDC position will prevail either in the courts of Zimbabwe or through a political process through SADC. So markets, it's a matter of time for them to readjust, realign, and at the same time correct themselves to say this is the environment we are living pre-2008, we have to live with it. And for sure, 1,138 companies are being targeted for indigenization, and chances are quite high that ZANU-PF government is not going to be retreating in that move.
Let's unpack the fulcrum of the ZANU-PF pre-election policy fulcrum, which is the indigenization policy. We've seen when they were starting to introduce it, we've seen a number of state parastatals, taking part in business. Do you see parastatals playing any significant role in the economy?
That's a very interesting one. If you look at the parastatals in Zimbabwe, at independence there were around 14 parastatals. And going into this year, you will see we've got about 77 parastatals. So you could see the appetite of government to fund complacence and the failure of efficiency in most of the bodies had been quite symptomatic of the increase in the number of parastatals, and they had continued being a threat to the recovery of the economy as it continued to be bloated. If there was no financial auditing, if you look at the Public Finance Management Act from a constitutional perspective, parastatals had been organizations which were not audited. There had been a lot of nepotism and also corruption which had been leveled against parastatals. They continue being a drain on the fiscus of the nation. And at the same time, for you to expect the parastatals to change the way they've been doing things when you know the background to their existence, it's also to do with political appointments. It's quite asking for too much. Naturally, the civil sector or a bureaucracy which defines the Zimbabwe economy, it's something very hard to dismantle, as just it is common to most African states. So parastatals are expected to continue acting as a threat to the fiscus. The best way possibly was to attract foreign direct investment, but given the stance of indigenization which had been employed by ZANU-PF government, the chances of having FDI inflows into the country are quite very curtailed. They are so decimated and limited to the extent that possibly what could be needed is for a restructure and reform of the indigenization policy, as we know for sure that with the current global international crisis of finance, chances of attracting FDI are very limited for an economy like Zimbabwe. You look in most of the economies in Africa, you see that countries like Angola, Mozambique, even South Africa is being surpassed by growth economies like Angola and Mozambique. The reason being policies which are enabling the foreign investors to grow their appetite. But with the stance of Zimbabwean government today, you realize that it will somehow take not less than 30 years for FDI to be felt at significant level, which means poverty will continue biting into the kitchens and possibly bedrooms of most Zimbabwean citizens.
Yeah, but Christopher, the indigenization policy, so far it has tended to somehow resurrect, should I say, some of these parastatals that we know have not been operating to the satisfaction or profitably. But we have seen the indigenization policy coming in to somehow revive them. I can give an example of the parastatals that are participating in the diamond industry. Don't you think there should be some policy change, or something must change around the indigenization policy? And what do you think also should change policy-wise if this ZANU-PF government is going to move the economy forward?
I'm not sure on your question about whether indigenization is propping parastatals, because even if you look at the mining companies, there's Engine Investments, which is a joint venture with the Chinese government. You could see the reason why the Chinese are also involved in Engine. This is maybe a part of acceptance by ZANU-PF that they can't go it alone when it comes to such a high capital intensive Actually, if you look at the statistics to say the quantum of diamond reserves in Zimbabwe, which is rated in the top 5 in terms of diamond reserves in the world, vis-a-vis what had been extracted so far, you will see the absence or near death of technology or geophysics in terms of exploration, which had costed also and increased the opportunity cost of getting returns or revenues from diamonds. So I'm not sure if we could ever relate indigenization as a policy and parastatals themselves. Parastatals in their own right, they'd extend as the extension of patronage, to some extent corruption, and to a very serious extent also there had been a drain to the fiscus of the 3.9 billion US dollars which had been collected across the country of revenue. Realized that not less than 3% was just to the administration and upkeep of civil of workers, rather from the parastatals. So there'd been a call, even in this government, when Tendai Biti came as the treasury boss, to see to it that the parastatals are earmarked for privatization. But we realized that the difference between politics, government, and political parties in Africa and Zimbabwe in particular in this scenario, it's quite very slim, if not non-existent. So for you to call for the privatization of parastatals, sometimes it means we have to deal with someone who would have appointed them, which had been proving to be quite not costly but very impossible to the Zimbabwean market.
The ZANU-PF party has already indicated that it intends to return the Zimbabwean dollar as some kind of, restoring the sovereignty status that they so love. And I know it's one of the greatest fears of the people of Zimbabwe and the business sector as well. But the Reserve Bank governor, just a few days ago, moved to issue a statement to allay reports that there was an imminent return of the Zimbabwean dollar. Could that have been influenced in any way by the fall in the performance of the Zimbabwe Stock Exchange?
I wouldn't want to relate the issue of Zim dollar return to how the equities market had performed. One thing for sure is it's not news, whether it's coming from Governor Gono or whoever is in the structures of government today, to say there's no room for return of Zim dollar rather. Zim dollar will not return as long as there's no macroeconomic convergence. Zim dollar will return as long as the unemployment rate. Zim dollar will not return as long as the economy is still in tatters or in a comatose state like we're experiencing today. So possibly for someone to wake up and try to give a position to say we don't have a room for the return of Zim dollar, it's not really news. Zim dollar will return when the confidence is there. No one in the office, either political, constitutional, or even the market, who have the audacity rather and the power to define the return of Zim dollar. Zim dollar will return because the market is interested in it, which is not possible at the moment. So possibly for the market to get worried and anxiety to grip to people to say Zim dollar is to return, possibly it's a preposterous feeling, which should not in any way affect the business of the day. As we know for sure that the industry is still decimated, capitalization is very low, external debt is above 10.7 billion, which in simpler terms means everyone in Zimbabwe is owing the external world not less than $600, including someone who is born today. So given such economic facts, you realize that to return a Zim dollar is just a case of mirage. It's not something which you can expect at the moment.
Yeah, but we've had quite a lot of ZANU-PF officials, including the party leader himself, Mr. Robert Mugabe, actually indicating that they would love at some point to return the Zim dollar. And we've seen in the past the way the ZANU-PF government has run the economy. What gives you the confidence that they will not return the Zim dollar anytime soon? Because I think and I believe there are some advantages, personal or selfish advantages for them to return the Zim dollar.
I personally don't think so. If you look at the events on the ground, even the Politburo meeting which was held this week in Zimbabwe from ZANU-PF angle, I think they were quite very clear to say this is no time to return the Zim dollar. So, which will leave me also saying is still persistence of speculative behavior by market active guys who are involved. The return of Zim dollar, will continue to say, it's not a choice. It's not a policy stance we will take and wake up and say, let's return the Zim dollar. It's a result of fundamentals. So I'm quite sure that no matter what amount of politicking, the politicking will not allow for the return of Zim dollar at the moment, as ZANU-PF is quite very aware than any other political party of the effects, the detrimental, the disastrous consequences of a return of a local unit. So I was too limited to speculation. But one thing for sure is I'm 100% sure that there's no room for dollar return, not in the next 3 years.
And in that vein, I think whoever is going to be appointed, the Minister of Finance or the Minister of Economic Investment, would be key to this discussion that we are having here today. What qualities, like as someone who is on the ground, someone in the market on a daily basis, what qualities would you say anyone or someone who is going to be appointed the Minister of Finance should have so that this economy can be able to move forward? And should the Minister of Finance and Economy be one ministry merged together, or they should be kept separate?
Well, that question, it's a case of an egg and a chicken, possibly. Because for you to expect a good Minister of Finance when he's working with bad apples is possibly asking for too much. Maybe the question should be, what kind of behavior should you expect from the president going forward in terms of appointment of a minister? Because if a minister doesn't fit the jigsaw puzzle, it remains very impossible, or rather very unnecessary. So generally speaking, we can safely say the minister we're expecting is a minister to whom president will appreciate that slogans will not work when it comes to budgeting of the nation. Slogans will not work when it comes to economic growth. Slogans will also not work when it comes to where to allocate funds. It should be a rational matter to which allocation of funds should benefit every citizen, regardless of your political affiliation or background. A minister who is more of a technocrat than a politician. I think people still have memory of 2000 when Mugabe appointed technocrats who included the likes of Gosana Moyo. That's when Zimbabwean also made a comeback, and a host of other ministers. So I realized that it's necessary for Robert Mugabe's government possibly to look at it and say, look, we had done it, or we had seen all these ministers, some of them who are on our side, but they are clueless about how to move the nation out of the very problems it is immersed in, because we are still on a false hope where people think economy is improving when still unemployment is high, poverty levels are still high, most people are living on less than $1 per day. You look at the social services, you go to the clinics, hospitals in Zimbabwe, they are still in a very dilapidated state. There's nothing to celebrate in terms of all the infrastructure in Zimbabwe at the moment. So a president should be prepared to see to it that he meets a minister to whom he will face and say, Mr. President, you are wrong on A, B, C, D. We can't move on as a nation. So we are hoping and wishing at the same time possibly that this is a minister who knows business, a minister who could be grounded. There are quite names which can also be mentioned who could be good candidates for that office. It's not necessarily a political office as we look forward. It has to be an office of technocrats, an office of specialization.
Some people have said no matter what ZANU-PF government does with the indigenization policy, it will need foreign investment somehow to come in and boost whatever they will be doing with the indigenization policy. But where does the indigenization policy leave the prospects of foreign investment in Zimbabwe, given the fact that prior to elections, we've had the Minister of Indigenization pushing for the indigenization of foreign banks, which are quite critical in foreign direct investment, the movement of capital around the world. Yet there is this talk that there must be. Are there any prospects for foreign investment?
Prospects for foreign investment sometimes they are linked to a host of factors, but indigenization, you can't really escape it to say it's not necessary. It's a fundamental issue to which investors are worried about in Zimbabwe. I'm quite sure and confident that it's not news even within ZANU-PF structures to note to it that indigenization had been scaring away investors. There's evidence to it. In 2009 April, when the law was promulgated to become effective in Zimbabwe, you could see the market itself, it shaded not less than 19% on a month basis, which is quite disastrous, and it's quite well documented. So, but I know for sure that possibly this could be the last term of Robert Mugabe as a leader of his party and the nation. So chances are quite high that possibly the whole talk, hula baloo about indigenization, somehow it will be whittled down. At the moment it was necessary, it was important to satisfy the electorate, which made them proud in the last election. But going forward, they know for sure that it's not sustainable. The reason why sometimes there's noise about looking east, it's an acceptance that domestic look is not possible. We can look somewhere, but the choice is just trying to divert from the west to the east. So you can't really overemphasize the role of foreign direct investment And the new government which is going to come, it knows for sure it will be a case of trying to balance between maximizing profits for companies or maximizing votes for the electorate. But I'm not sure if it's still necessary to maximize votes when they are just entrusted with the nation for the next 5 years, which we think ZANU-PF will be somehow whittling down in some of its demands.
The majority of Zimbabweans are looking forward to benefiting from some of the resources that our country is endowed with. And one particular mineral that they are looking forward to is the diamonds. Do you see diamonds playing any critical role in the resumption of proper economic growth in Zimbabwe?
I think it's high time Zimbabweans should be quite more demanding in their approach and appreciation of how things are structured. It's not only diamonds. We have got platinum, which had been attracting very high international prices in terms of their commodities. We have gold in Zimbabwe. We've got a host of all other minerals. Possibly the reason why sometimes we realize that the noise about diamonds had seen ZANU-PF government somehow consolidating its stay in power is the misconception of thinking that it's diamonds which everyone should benefit from. Zimbabwe has more than 40 exploitable minerals, and the transparency and accountability should be thrust upon the leaders to say, look, with all the minerals we boast of in Africa, in the world, how can we extract these minerals to the benefit of each and every citizen? What is needed is a leaner government, and possibly it could be advised to the president to say you can't afford to continue having a bloated cabinet when you are having people who are hungry. You can't continue appointing deputy ministers when they do virtually nothing in the government. Possibly with a 270 member parliament vis-a-vis a nation of around 13 million people, you can see something is wrong. There's an anomaly to it. So the issue is not in diamonds, it's in Zimbabwean minerals. There are more minerals than diamonds. There are more minerals which are also attracting better prices as we speak today than diamonds, which are extracted in Zimbabwe. So the focus on diamonds should be separated from a political focus. Let us not just overemphasize on diamonds. It's on transparency. Let corrupt ministers face the X. That should be the message going forward.
And lastly, in brief, Christopher, what will it take for the Zimbabwean economy to stand on both its feet once again, as it used to do in the 1990s?
It's to attract foreign direct investment, is to use Anti-Corruption Commission body to its fullest potential. We have got ministers who had been corrupt. As long as there are allegations, sometimes it will be very hard to deal with such corrupt ministers, but they exist for sure. It's also very necessary to make sure that the government itself is going to promote education. As you know that we boast of the high literacy rate in Africa, but if you look in terms of transition from primary to secondary education, you realize that it's only about 50% of the scholars or students who transition from primary to secondary education. And that kind of bottleneck, where only 50% are qualifying for secondary education, is because of poverty in the country. So the government should not continue boasting about literacy without looking at the after effects of literacy. Because literacy itself is just being able to write and read. But if you can't think beyond writing and reading, then you can't develop a nation. That's the point.
This has been This is Africa. Thank you for joining us, and once again, thank you, Christopher, for joining us, and it's goodbye from Harare.